Slaves were not free labor. Like wage labor, they cost the employer. However, the transaction and relation that legitimized the ownership of the slave by the master differed. Slaves' employers had property rights over them. The owners who held title over bondsmen purchased the slave's body. Thus, the masters controlled the labor and the produce, including children, of the slaves until they died, were sold, or gained freedom. Employers who hired wage laborers possessed just the workers' labor for an agreed-upon period, in return for some type of currency. Slave prices in antebellum America varied. The fluctuations of the market affected prices as did the talents or weaknesses possessed by the slaves. In the South, after 1830, skilled slaves cost between $1,500 and $2,000. Such slaves were carpenters, bricklayers, barbers, cooks, weavers, blacksmiths, dressmakers, nurses, musicians, mechanics, agriculturalists, managers, midwives, and house servants. Slaves with a history of drunkenness, runaways, those too young or too old or afflicted with some infirmity cost anywhere between $300 to $800. Unskilled slaves were also more prone to be sold during good or bad economic times. One planter, experiencing hardships, wrote an acquaintance that he sold, quote, about half of his Negroes, those that are unfaithful, those women that pretend to be always sick, and such rebellious slaves. It is dangerous to hold such property, end quote. Middle-class planters who possessed 7 or less slaves experienced more economic troubles than the big plantation owners, who held 16 or more slaves. Middle-class planters also tended to have greater turnover during rough periods. Nevertheless, even these middle-class planters would have sold the less valuable slaves first. And here we see two important contradictions. Slaves lacked humanity in the eyes of their masters, but their masters nevertheless valued them. Slaves lacked any legal rights, but the skills they possessed, especially those in demand by their masters, granted them, relatively speaking, greater security. The demand and profitability of slaves resulted from 3 main factors. First, the efficiency with which slaves after 1815 could deseed cotton by consequence of the cotton gin. Second, the rich soil available to American planters in the western states of Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. These new lands placed the United States at the head of the cotton market. Even more wonderful for the planters, the world demand for cotton was so high that overproduction could not overflood markets and hurt the profits made by this cash crop. Third, the production of cotton required 70% more laborers per acre than the production of corn and other similar crops. This demand for labor, the global demand for cotton, and its efficient production all inflated the cost of slaves. The profits gained by slave markets became lucrative. A southern planter confirmed, quote, to sell cotton in order to buy Negroes, to make more cotton, to buy more Negroes, is the aim and direct tendency of all the operations of the thoroughgoing cotton planter. His whole soul is wrapped up in the pursuit, end quote. In 1810, the American slave population was 1,191,354. 50 years later, it had reached 3,953,760. Economically, almost all Southerners preferred slaves to wage laborers. because the cost of employing them in the cotton fields, as well as in the cultivation of sugar, tobacco, and rice, was less than hiring wage workers. During good times, slaveholders made plenty of money, and during trying periods, they still saved by utilizing slave labor. Perhaps for this reason, masters permitted their chattel to marry. However, when children failed to be a product of these unions, planters were quick to encourage slave wives to bed other men. A visitor to a plantation noted that a fruitful woman among them, being very much valued by the planters, and numerous children esteemed the highest riches in the country. Southerners had political and ideological reasons, besides economic, for preferring to employ slaves rather than wage laborers. The institution of slavery suited well Southerners' upper, middle, and lower class romanticism for paternalism, traditionalism, and social hierarchy. Yet for the middling and lower class planters, the demand for money was persistent, even though they struggled in hopes of achieving the high class plantation man dream, where such materialism was vulgar. An English guest in the South observed, quote, "This passion for the acquisition of money is much stronger and more universal in this country than in any other under the sun, at least that I have visited," end quote. For the middling and lower class planters, dual careers were common. To offset the poor income from farming, these slaveholders were prone to travel more in search of financial opportunities. They spent time moonlighting as carpenter, blacksmiths, weavers, mechanics, tailors. Thus, the slaves of such masters had more autonomy, but they had to be self-motivated, disciplined, in addition to having versatile skills. This class of slaveholders needed slaves to be as occupationally savvy as themselves. All slaves were not equal. A slave with skills benefited the master, because an individual who owned another possessed the entirety of the slave, body and mind, and all the actions of a slave's daily life that resulted from a smart and healthy bondsman. One slave in Arkansas named Reuben started on his master's farm during a tough patch. By the slave's managerial and agricultural skills, he pulled his master's farm out of debt and made, quote, approximately $150,000 in profits during his first year of enslavement. A slave that earned the master profits gained privileges usually. Some slaves who worked as plantation managers or had other valued talents could earn wages, $200 annually in the position of an overseer. In doing so, the master saved a substantial amount, since a free white overseer cost $1,000 to $2,000 in wages yearly. For a farmer that was busy at other jobs, struggling to kickstart his plantations, these savings were a godsend. Unfortunately, a slave that did the work of an overseer fulfilled all the obligations of the job but lacked the title and money earned by a white overseer. The $200 granted to the slave by the master was an incentive to continue earning profits for his owner. The master provided these slaves also greater autonomy to travel to markets and trade or possess small plots of land to farm. Sometimes, masters even allowed slaves to rent their labor, so long as a cut of the wages earned by their slaves returned to the masters. Relative to the life of a field hand, it was a better situation, but masters still cheated the slaves. Now, it should not be forgotten that even if some masters granted skilled slaves privileges, the slave was still a slave and lacked legal rights. So besides being paid a dishonest wage by his owner, the slave was also commonly cheated by the rest of society, particularly when he or she traded on their own behalf. Laws in the antebellum South categorized slaves no different than horses. They were beasts of burden, and many times branded just like cattle. Laws also defined slaves in the same category as land. One early law declared, quote, "All Negro, mulatto, slaves shall be held to be real estate, and shall descend onto heirs and widows according to the custom of land inheritance," end quote. This meant that skilled slaves, whose masters granted them autonomy to sell their services to the public, could easily be robbed or bamboozled by whites refusing to pay for services rendered. Because of the economic and legal state of the slave, he or she lacked protection from the law. For this reason, a slave named Lunsford Lane, even though he earned relatively decent money by selling tobacco, he understood that as a slave his money was never his, so he kept his money hidden, quote, never venturing to put out a penny. Lane explained, nor to let anybody but my wife know that I was making money, end quote. The categorization of a slave as cattle or land also meant that if skilled slaves aroused the suspicion of local authorities and or white wage laborers who lacked the ability to compete against their cheaper slave counterparts, then masters, to protect their property from confiscation or vandalism, had to comply with the social rules of their society. Reuben, the slave from Arkansas, mentioned earlier, even though he pulled his master's farm out from economic ruin, the master still demoted him. Resentful local laborers alerted authorities who reminded Reuben's master that the law required, quote, the superintendence or presence of a white man among every body of slaves, end quote. In the United States, during the antebellum period, it was not necessarily any better if slaves bought themselves out of slavery with the money they earned. Southern states forbid slaves from conducting business. If a master filed to the state to emancipate a slave who had earned money as a slave, freedom could mean losing what money and property the slave had before their manumission. Anthony Weston was a bondsman in such a predicament. To avoid losing his millwright business and 20 slaves, which he acquired by his entrepreneurial skills and with the consent of his master, he had all his wealth under his wife's name and chose to remain a slave. The case of Weston was the exception, but the point here is that even skilled and smart slaves faced tremendous disadvantages, even when they lived relatively better lives compared to the other slaves, because they were slaves and all slaves lacked legal rights. For the unskilled bondsmen, circumstances got only exponentially worse. The lack of legal rights for slaves meant that masters could cut corners if they needed to make ends meet. Remember, slaves were like cattle or land. Masters skimped on the upkeep of their slaves, necessities of life like food, shelter, clothing, health care. One master griped that he had to feed 19 in number, myself, wife, and child, and overseer, and 15 Negroes. Many masters felt these services were at a cost to their families. The slaves had the bottom position on this hierarchy. Masters had the property rights to disregard the subsistence needs of slaves or grant all of them or somewhere between. It usually benefited masters to allocate the minimum the slave required to be productive and earn the master the cost of the slave's worth and then earn them profits. However, to save money, masters, like all businessmen, pinched pennies here and there, and the subsistence of their slaves was many times where they skimped on inventory. One visitor to a North Carolina plantation observed, quote, many of the young men and women slaves work stark naked in the plantations in the hot season, except a piece of cloth out of decency to cover their nakedness, upon which account they are not very expensive to the planters for their clothing, end quote. This negligence was to save money, and the behavior was very common. Even more alarming, masters routinely insured their slaves to protect their investments. If slaves remained productive, all was well. When slaves' productivity decreased, however, it was not uncommon among some slaveholders to try and collect insurance money, since the insurance money is worth more than the slave. One Southern slaveholder, Dr. Joseph C. Knott, commented on this practice, quote, when it ceases to be the interest of the owner to preserve the life of the slave, he will, in many instances, cease to be careful of it. Any man who will drive a horse cruelly will drive a Negro or operative to death, if he can gain anything by so doing. End quote. The legal state of a slave as cattle and or land transformed an individual into a commodity. Legally, being defined as nothing but an economic object, justified the master's inhumanity when the slave stopped being profitable. The financial relationship masters had to slaves meant that the slaves should be as productive as possible. Slaves' productivity was not theirs. In the antebellum South, it reflected the master's economic wealth. Not all slaves possessed the same qualities, but even the least skilled slaves, the field hands, remain flesh, blood, and muscle. They earn high profits for masters. Southern slaveholders did not all own the big plantations memorialized in American classics like Gone with the Wind. These were the minority. The majority were middle and low-class planters who experienced all sorts of obstacles in attempting to achieve the Southern slaveholder dream, and few ever did it. Their professional versatility and economic insecurity played an important role in determining the economics of antebellum slavery and the being of a slave. In turn, the slave played a key role in determining the economic culture of this social group of antebellum Southerners.